So the aim is to explore social work practice with involuntary service users. So recognising that a lot of the theories and approaches that we've been looking at throughout the module really derive from a background of service users voluntarily presenting for help or support, but that actually social workers certainly in some specific settings will regularly come into contact with service users who are involuntary, who you are mandated to work with, and that can create some challenges in kind of having clear frameworks in which to work. So Andrew Hill, in his textbook Working in Statutory Contexts, talks about the legal mandate for intervention usually being clear, but that on its own it's rarely enough to ensure an effective intervention. Successful statutory work will require an element of discussion and even negotiation with those affected over what's being done, why, and on what basis. And this is what he means when he talks about establishing the mandate. It's not that the basis for the work's unclear in law, rather the question is one of converting this legal mandate into a working relationship with the people involved that will allow social workers to carry out their duties effectively. There have been some challenges in relation to some of the literature about engaging with service users, and some of the skills and techniques that in the literature come from a counselling foundation, that actually when you're working with involuntary service users, are these things enough? Some writers, Rooney in 1992 and Evanoff and colleagues in 1994, have pointed out that where people do not want contact with social workers, empathy is unlikely to be enough to engage them. Instead, these authors argue that a social worker should seek to develop what they call motivational congruence. In other words, that a social worker should seek to maximise the fit between what the service user wants and what the social worker is trying to achieve. So really, and Evanoff and colleagues are quite realistic in their approach to this idea. They argue for a twin-track strategy of being clear about elements of the intervention that reflect the statutory mandate and are non-negotiable, whilst at the same time maximising the person's sense of understanding, choice and control over all other elements of the intervention. So this strategy reflects a commitment to anti-oppressive practice and to the principle of minimum intervention, and it maximises the opportunities for empowerment and partnership. So Harry Ferguson, in his book Child Protection Practice, promotes this idea of good authority, that actually we need to really start to think a little bit more deeply about how we manage this concept of authority. And he comes up with the requirement to think about three things. Firstly, to have a model or conceptual framework that clarifies its nature, role, ethical dimensions, appropriateness, and methods of application. All social workers have authority that derives from their statutory role. This is what Smith in 2008 calls legal rational authority in social work. But there's also reputational authority in the sense of the reputation and standing of their profession. And Harry Ferguson points to the fact that this seems to have been declining in recent years due to the criticisms that social workers have received following high-profile cases. So governments and social work employers have lacked trust in the ability of social workers to make skilled judgments about risks to children. So, there's been increasing kind of procedural responses to practice as a result of this. So this leads into the second one, thinking about an analysis of the relations of authority within the organisation and their impact on how frontline staff feel about and exercise authority. So some of those, increased proceduralisation of practice And also, human rights legislation that kind of empowers service users to have more rights to make formal complaints about workers, which agencies take incredibly serious. Those things can have an impact on frontline workers' sense of their own authority, voice and skill. And the third element to consider when we're thinking about good authority is personal authority, and understanding of one's own personal relationship to authority. So that might be about personal characteristics, but also all of us will have had experiences of authority that will potentially influence what Ferguson calls the internalized authoritative voice. And that as social workers we need to learn about how comfortable we are with having and using authority by thinking about and reflecting on that internalized authoritative voice. And Ferguson identifies that all three dimensions of authority come into play in every interaction that social workers make. So Harry Ferguson has developed what he calls an authoritative negotiated child protection model, and within that there are 8 dimensions or steps for good authoritative practice. So the first of these is to recognise authority and assume conflict and not cooperation. So recognising that actually it is likely that you are going to face some resistance within your work with service users, and be prepared for that. The second dimension is encourage openness and honest expression of feelings. Give the service user the opportunity to express as openly as they can their feelings about professional involvement. He does state that importantly there needs to be a ground rule that whilst expressing different perspectives is okay, that intimidating and abusive behaviour is not acceptable, and that mutual respect in communication is essential. But that actually the ability of service users to express their feelings of anger, frustration, whatever it is they're experiencing, is important in trying to develop an effective relationship. Dimension 3, identify what the resistance is really about and what is working well. The obvious thing is that, in child protection, the threat of losing their children is what the resistance is about, but there can be a whole range of other reasons why service users resist intervention. So it might be that their own personal characteristics, psychological and emotional problems actually make forming effective relationships really difficult, and that actually they experience resistance in a whole range of relationships. So really sort of teasing some of that stuff out. Dimension 4, identify the dangers to the children, so that identifying strengths is important, but it must be located within a risk assessment framework, and that is also reiterated by Turnell and Essex, who identify that actually one of the failings within the baby P case was that actually workers were focused too much on strengths and a solution-focused approach, that actually that needs to be set within a context of a risk assessment framework, so that it's really important that those dangers are clearly articulated. Dimension 5, identify what is non-negotiable. So the actions that must be taken to address the dangers that you've identified, so the actions that are non-negotiable must be identified. So this involves engaging the parents in identifying what needs to change, but actually you as a worker may need to be directive in including the issues that service users do not mention. And he lists a whole range of things that he sees as potentially non-negotiable. For example, the rules that set out the frequency of which the children must be seen and by whom, the need to make unannounced visits, the need to regularly see bedrooms, kitchens, the need to know about all the people who live or have significant contact with children. All of those things that are not negotiable. Dimension 6, identify what is negotiable. So there may be some elements of the child protection plan which are negotiable, and the worker should encourage parents to think as broadly as possible about the areas where they can exercise some choice. So it might be that parents can have some choice about selecting an intervention to promote their work with whatever plan is in place. It might include the style and method of approach, and what support and therapeutic services they may feel comfortable taking up. So there are some things that service users can have some choice in. Dimension 7, formulate a child protection plan. So the child protection plan should include a clear statement about the dangers and all the non-negotiable and negotiable areas. It should set out how the risks will be worked with by different professionals and the role of the safety support network in promoting child safety. And lastly, being clear about criteria for progress. So this involves social workers in collaboration with other professionals, specifying what will count as evidence of children's safety and well-being, and what the carer has to do to be regarded as a safe parent. So being really quite specific, not general, aspirations about care being better, needs to be really concrete. And there is a nod to the cycle of change or trans-theoretical model that we've covered here, recognising that in the change process there may be relapses. So thinking about how as a practitioner you can use those models to understand the stages that parents are at in recognising their problems and being motivated and to achieve it. So he highlights these 8 dimensions to using authority effectively in child protection contexts. So here are some characteristics of effective work from Chris Trotter's book, which is in the reference list, and he identifies, based on his own research and that of others, some of the characteristics that you can find in this kind of work. The first of those is role clarification. So this is helping the service users to understand the roles of the worker and the role of the client in the direct practice process. And he highlights the importance of ongoing discussion, so not just saying it at the start of your work, but actually revisiting issues such as the purpose of the intervention, your own dual role as a social worker, as a helper and also a social controller, revisiting ideas around authority and how the authority that you have within your role might be used, and revisiting conversations around confidentiality. The second is reinforcing and modelling pro-social values. So actions and values which support and care for others, modelling and demonstrating positive behaviours in your own practice, being clear about the values that you wish to promote and purposefully encouraging them through praise and other reward systems. The third is collaborative problem solving. So working with the client's definition of problems, developing modest achievable goals and strategies to achieve. So he points to all the research evidence about this idea of collaborative problem solving. And I guess that can be challenging sometimes when working with involuntary service users in them defining the problem and the goals. But actually, if you go back to those ideas around motivational congruence, so coming to a place where actually a service user can start to identify actually, even how do I ensure that you leave me alone as a social worker, that actually there is some motivational congruence. We both want the same thing. We might, we might be approaching it in different ways, but that actually there's much more evidence of effectiveness when that collaborative problem solving is in place. And the last is cognitive behavioural strategies, helping clients change thinking patterns in relation to specific issues. He separates that out. I mean, in some respects, the reinforcing and modelling pro-social values does link with cognitive behavioural approaches, but he does highlight that separately as well. So those are some of the discussions in the literature about how to work with resistance and how to work with involuntary service users. And if you want to follow up any of those, these are the references from this presentation.